Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Chapter 5. Subsection 1. There was someone stroking his hand, and that stroking gave him ineffable consolation. It was a regular rhythmical movement from wrist to fingers, and he remained with his eyes closed, enjoying it. Then he perceived that his left hand was also firmly and tenderly held, and this double support on both sides reassured and bore him up. Then he became aware of pain that rested on him, like a hat drawn down to his eyes. It was exterior, not interior. It was not, that is to say, in his consciousness, but rather was faced and contemplated by it. The pain was a continuous pulsation, rather like the throb of a motor engine, though far slower, a series of noiseless explosions from a point, like the bursting of a shell, and he perceived the colour of them was a kind of electric blue. As he opened his eyes, the pain sensibly decreased, or at least retired a little way off. A voice was talking gently and soothingly, and this, like the stroking of his hand, was an extraordinary consolation, though he did not at present understand one word that it was saying. The stroking stopped, and there was a stir in the room. He thought that someone had gone out. "Go on with that, please," he said, moving his fingers a little. "I like that." The stroking began again. "Is it all right?" "Yes, perfectly right. It's all over." "What time is it?" "It's just 12:30. "Why, I can see." "Yes, of course you can." He remained without speaking again for a minute or two, turning his eyes about, taking in new impressions, and considering the marvel that he could do so. The pain was still there, just as before, like a person hammering heavily on a closed door and seeking entrance. He felt he could not bother to open and see who was there. He would presently, when he had time to look about him. There was a mirror over the fireplace, framed in gilt carved wood, with a kind of little rail at the top of the glass. This was extremely interesting, because although he knew it was a mirror, it was also the Thames at Westminster. The rail was the bridge, and the glass was the surface of the water, and above there were the houses, lit from within and glowing with the light of sunset upon them. It was extraordinarily beautiful. How curious that it was both a mirror and the Thames. Were other things in the room like that? On the right there was a tall folding screen, and the top of the white door appeared above it. These were all right, but in front was a kind of tall carved lamp support, like a very elongated table. There was a vase of flowers on this. But it was not only a table and flowers, it was also the leg of a giant, from the knee to the ankle. The rest of the giant must be above the roof. He became more and more interested, and looked to the left. The window was on the left, with the blind drawn down, and before it stood another table with a tall flowering plant. But it was not just a table and a plant. It was also the figure of a cavalier in a plumed hat with his hand raised as if in defiance. He thought he really must be a little feverish, or was it that his eyes were not quite right after all? It was surely unreasonable and impossible that these things could be themselves, and yet also things with which they could not really have even the remotest connection. "Can I really see all right?" he asked. "Oh yes, perfectly." He turned his eyes to see who spoke. He had practically forgotten these people. The woman who had spoken was a little grey-haired, delicate-looking person, dressed in white. It was she who was holding his left hand. He liked her face. She looked human and kindly. Then he turned his eyes to the right, and a tall girl in blue, with a white apron from her throat to below her knees, which was as far as he could see, sat there. It was she who was still stroking his hand. She had a clear, steady face, dark hair and grey eyes. She was rather of the Enid type. Yes, he liked her too. "You're Nurse Deacon, aren't you?" he said. "Yes, Sir Neville." "And you're Miss Brance," he began, turning his eyes back. But at that instant the knocking pain waxed intolerable, and he drew a swift hiss of agony. "Oh, it hurts," he moaned, and shut his eyes. "The syringe again," he heard whispered across the blazing explosions of blue light. Presently he felt his left arm being handled, as if someone had pulled up his pyjama sleeve and was lightly fingering his forearm. Then there was a tiny touch of a different kind, no more than that. Then, little by little, though the pain did not cease, it grew more remote and even tolerable. After a period, he began to feel restless. He supposed that it was morphia that had been given to him, and he was coming to the conclusion that morphia was a very much overrated drug. It had quieted him in a sort of physical way, but it had not really touched the seat of the trouble. The pain was there, just as before, hammering still, though in a muffled kind of way, but it was practically as bad, and there were no delicious sensations, such as he had always understood resulted from an injection. He felt merely oppressed and restless, not soothed. This would never do. He drew a long breath and opened his eyes once more. He thought he would talk a little bit and find out things. Besides, it might distract him. "Miss Brans?" "Miss Brans has gone downstairs. She'll be back presently." "Oh, it doesn't matter. Look here, nurse, was the operation successful?" "Yes, perfectly," came the quiet voice. "Why, you can see again?" "Yes, that's all right." "Nurse?" "Yes, Sir Neville?" "Doctor's gone, I suppose?" "They've been gone over an hour." "Oh, I suppose Sir Arthur will be coming back." "He'll telephone for news this evening. We've told him you're doing very well. He'll come if you want him, of course." "Did I use bad language this morning? Don't tell me lies, will you?" He turned his eyes to see her face as she answered, and saw that she was smiling a little. "No, Sir Neville, indeed you didn't. You only spoke twice." "When? What did I say?" "Once during the operation, and once when the men were carrying you upstairs. You said, 'Oh, my God!'" "That was really all?" She nodded. "Yes." "Oh, I say, nurse, you know that wasn't a prayer. I'm not a bit pious. That was an expletive." He heard her laugh softly. Really, she was very human and pleasant. "Would you like anything to eat or drink, Sir Neville? Are you thirsty at all? You mustn't talk much, you know." He questioned himself. Was he thirsty? No. Hungry? On the contrary, food seemed entirely disgusting. "I wouldn't eat if you gave me £100. You can let go of my hands, please." He drew his hands together as she lifted the sheet for him to do so. "Now, I must talk. I want to know a lot of things." "Don't you think you can go to sleep a little?" "No." "How can I, with this beastly bandage all over my head? Has Mrs. Fanning gone away? I should like to see her. And Algy." "I'm afraid you mustn't, Sir Neville. Besides, they've both gone away. Miss Brans went down half an hour ago to say how well you were doing." "Oh, why are the blinds down? I'm not dead, am I?" "Indeed you're not, Sir Neville. But the light would bother you. Just lie quite still if you can, and..." "Just lie quite still if you can, and... Well, and the operation really was successful? It wasn't cancer, was it?" "Nothing of the kind, Sir Neville. And you're doing very well indeed. And it's all over? Really all over? And I shan't have to go down to that beastly little room any more?" He spoke vehemently, and the pain in his head grew vehement too. "Sir Neville, you really must be more quiet. You don't want me to have to send for Miss Brans. She's at lunch too." You'll swear it's not cancer?" "Of course I will. Now, do you think a little chicken jelly or soup?" He considered this slowly. Soup, of course, was intolerable, but cold chicken jelly... "You'll have to have something, you know. You had no breakfast this morning." "Shall I feel better if I do? I don't feel a bit well, you know. It's not cancer, I think he said. I think perhaps chicken jelly, if it's cold." "Of course, you'll feel better. Will you lie still if I leave you for 2 minutes?" "Yes, all right. And perhaps half a cigarette afterwards." "I don't know. Oh Lord, my head. Subsection 2. Just get the syringe again, whispered a voice at some infinitely later period, across the blinding explosions of pain, and then get the dressings ready. He did not know in the least what time it was, and it was far too great an effort to ask, but he opened his tormented eyes and saw that a shaded electric lamp stood by his bed. Yet still the pain was not actually crushing. He never felt that he really could not bear it any more. Only it was necessary to keep his attention firmly fixed upon it, and his will braced to meet it. The pain and he were two, not one. He was making two other curious discoveries. One was that his nervous system was very much larger than his body. It had thrown out fibres and tentacles throughout the whole bed, so that even the faintest touch on the clothes thrilled through him. Just now, one of the women had brushed the end of the bed with her skirt, and he had winced as if he had been struck. Some of the fibres reached even down upon the floor, so that every vibration of a footstep, however soft, ran through him. The centre of the system was rather to the left and forward of the top of his head, almost on his temple, and it was to this brooding, incarnate pain that every message came. He felt the prick of the needle very much more distinctly this time. It was a tiny additional pain. His head appeared to register and acknowledge it promptly. "I don't think I'll have any more of that," he murmured. "It's no good, you know." Then he closed his eyes again. But the dressing of the wound was a far greater horror. Something in the tone of the voices that spoke to him rendered resistance impossible. He realised that it must be gone through. So he lay still with his eyes closed, trying to think how pleasant it would be when it was all over, permitting hands to move over his head, feeling a shocking kind of cold at one point that made him shiver, succeeded by a trickling kind of warmth that was followed by a little metallic noise in some vessel. This warmth was faintly comforting. He deliberately kept his eyes closed, for fear that that which trickled might be blood, and he should see it. Then the bandages closed again on his head. It was horrible while they were being put on. It was reassuring when all was done, and his head rested again easily on the pillows. Then he opened his eyes. "Thanks very much," he said. Then he wondered whether he had been behaving well. He couldn't remember having said thank you before at all. He wondered whether he had shown himself a shocking coward. "Miss Brance?" "You mustn't talk, Sir Neville. I want you to lie quite still." He let his eyes wander over her little white figure. She was dressed for a dinner, it seemed, in a sort of tea gown, but had an apron on, and linen sleeves drawn over her arms. She looked very familiar and reassuring somehow. It was marvellous that anyone could be dressed for dinner. He looked away for her at a soft sound, and saw that the nurse was wheeling away behind one of the screens a little plate-glass table. The table had various things on it. He decided to pay no attention to Miss Brance's remark. "Has Sir Arthur Hansworth been again?" "I'm afraid you mustn't talk, Sir Neville. Just try to lie quite still and go to sleep." Then the little figure went noiselessly across the dim-lit room and disappeared. He lay considering. At some further remote period, Miss Brance was by him again. She carried a little instrument in her hand. "How do you feel now, Sir Neville?" "I think I'm better. May I talk a little, please?" She sat down by his bedside as the nurse rose and went out. "Well, just a little, but it's nearly 10 o'clock, you know. Nurse Deacon will be back to settle you for the night directly, and then the night nurse will come on duty." "Will she be in the room?" "No, just on the landing outside. But she'll come immediately if you ring. I want you to have a good sleep. I won't have any more morphia, please. I've brought something quite different this time." "What is it?" "Never mind about that, Sir Neville, but it's quite different." "It's not cancer I've got, is it?" He felt it was most important to settle this question. It had been on his mind a little, and he meant to have asked Nurse Deacon, but somehow it had been forgotten. "Oh, no, not a trace. You need have no fear whatever of that. Is the pain less?" "I think it is, a little. But it goes on hammering, you know." "Well, that'll get better every hour. You've had hardly any proper sleep at all today." "When can I see my aunt?" "Oh, in a day or two." We shall have to see how you get on. I shall telephone her tonight as soon as you're settled. We've had a good many inquiries." "Oh, who?" "Well, Lord Maresfield has been one, and telephoned again this evening. Then Mr. Lennox came again this afternoon. Then a Mrs. Bessington called about 6. "What?" "Mrs. Bessington. She said that Mrs. Fanning had told her, and any amount of flowers have come, but I'm afraid you mustn't have them till tomorrow morning." "I suppose no one else came with Mrs. Bessington?" "No, she came alone." As Neville did not move or speak again, the little woman stood up. "Nurse Deacon is just coming, I think." When the settling for the night had been finished, Neville again lay very still. The process had really been quite interesting. He could not follow all the tactics carried out by the two nurses. He had raised himself a little on their arms. He had lifted his feet all as he was bidden. His blankets had been raised, a sheet pulled, and then the blankets lowered again. The result of all that was within 5 minutes he lay between fresh sheets above and below and new cool pillows. Then the pyjama sleeve had been pulled up again, and the prick had followed, more distinct than ever. Finally, the two women moved noiselessly about the room, shifting and arranging this and that. A few more coals were put on the fire. Then they had bidden him good night. The bell button and the light button with a box of cigarettes, a matchbox, and a covered glass of barley water all stood within easy reach on the table by his bedside. He had managed too, with only very slight disgust, 6 more spoonfuls of chicken jelly. He stared at the walls that wavered in the firelight, and the mirror that had been the Thames at Westminster this afternoon. Mrs. Bessington had been to call this afternoon. He had known well enough, even before he had asked, that she had come alone. He knew now, too, that she must have come without her daughter's knowledge, and that she would not say a word to that daughter of what she had heard. Yet in his weakness and his drug-inspired semi-delirium, there was one side of him that strove to pretend that it was not so, and that Enid was at least a little sorry to hear of his new trouble. But it was no more than pretence. Just as he had known this afternoon that the mirror was not really the Thames, and that the growing plant was not a cavalier, so he knew now that Enid was nothing to him, nor he to her, that she had shown herself completely another from that which he had fancied her, even though it gave him a miserably pleasant kind of pain to pretend that she was relenting. So in his weakness he turned the point in his soul again and again, and the pains of both body and mind began to work. There were other considerations too, beginning to present themselves. The nurse looked in noiselessly about midnight, hoping that he might be asleep, but so soon as she looked, she caught the glimmer of the fire in his black eyes. But he said nothing, and she went out. She looked in again an hour later, and still he was awake. He said he hadn't succeeded in getting to sleep yet. Between 3 and 4, he rang for her. "It's not the least good," he said. "I can't sleep. Would you just turn up the light and give me a book or two? Oh, yes, and just cut 6 cigarettes in half. I find I can't quite manage a whole one." Subsection 3. Now then, Sir Neville, let's have a look. It was quite an odd sensation for him, next morning about 11, to set eyes for the first time upon the man whose voice he knew so well from his first interview with him, the man who had performed the butchery on him only 24 hours before. Sir Arthur Hansworth was not much like Algy's description of him. He was much leaner in body than Neville had imagined. His eyes were less alert and bright. He was extremely well dressed in a dark grey morning suit. The process of having a look was not pleasant. Neville had to lie right over on his side, with his face half buried in the pillow, and feel fingers touching the top of his head in a manner that gave him a sensation of having no skull protection at all. Once or twice during the process, and while the surgeon himself dressed the wound, Neville caught sight of his long, dry-looking fingers. It was those fingers that had held the corkscrew-like instrument yesterday. He felt curiously exhausted, not indeed with the pain, since a couple of hours' sleep after 7 o'clock this morning had certainly eased it very greatly, but with the effort he had to make to keep his nerves tight and rigid while the examination was made. His nerves felt raw and apprehensive while this went on, and appeared to relax like damp fiddle strings when it was over. and he lay back again on his pillows, crowned with clean bandages. He felt a dull kind of resentment against the surgeon. "Well?" he asked. "It's perfectly satisfactory," said the other, watching his face with a searching kind of look. "And the pain's better, I hear?" "Oh, yes. When shall I be able to go away, do you think?" "It depends almost entirely on yourself, Sir Neville. The thing that matters now is the healing of the wound. If you do what you are told, and can keep quiet, I should think you could travel in 10 days or a fortnight." "And the operation was successful?" "Perfectly," said the other shortly. Neville was conscious of a considerable relief. It was true that his nurses had implied as much, but it was more satisfactory to hear of it from the surgeon himself. And immediately his thoughts turned to his own people. "When may my aunts come and see me, do you think?" "You want to see her very much?" "If I may." "Well, you might see her for half an hour this afternoon. She might come and have a cup of tea with you if you liked." Neville looked up sharply. He had no idea that it would be allowed so soon. From a very slight air in the surgeon's manner, he had thought it would be several days before anyone would be allowed to come. "Well, that's very good of you. You have seen her, I suppose?" "I saw her yesterday, after the operation, but she mustn't come unless you really can get some sleep before." "That'll be all right," said Neville. "I feel more like it today,